Delighted to welcome you today to Intersection, where theology and practice meet. My co-host, Randy Harris, and myself, Carson Reed, are delighted to welcome you here today. And we're welcoming our special guest, Robert Creech. Robert, it's a delight to have you with us here today.
I've been looking forward to this for some time.
It's great. To introduce everyone to Robert, Dr. Creech is a longtime professor at Truett, at Baylor, Truett Theological Schools there. He's holds a chair there in pastoral leadership and has taught for many years in the areas of pastoral care and in church leadership. After a long tenure as a senior pastor for a church in Houston, Texas, and continues to work in congregational life. He's serving right now as an interim pastor for Trinity Baptist in San Antonio, Texas. So Robert has written a great deal, and I think we'll be able to post several of his books in the chat for you to follow along if you'd like to learn more about some of Robert's work. But I want to point out three of those books. One is called The Leader's Journey, which is now in a second edition. Another book that's just out, particularly for those who may be interested in the Baptist tradition, and for those of you who in Churches of Christ, in many ways, he's speaking to the larger Anabaptist tradition in a book called Pastoral Theology in the Baptist Tradition. This is a new one out from Baker. And then another book that is where I first encountered in any depth, Robert, your career is the one on family systems and congregational life. These books serve as a great introduction to thinking deeply about the work of pastoral leadership, leadership in congregational life. And boy, in this day and time, as we talk today about pastoral leadership in troubled times, Robert, it's just a delight to have someone with your background to engage with. So thank you again for joining us today.
Thanks, Carson.
Well, a couple of notes. I see folks writing in where they're tuning in. We're delighted to see folks from lots of places. As we engage with Robert throughout the hour, invite our participants to send in questions. We're going to use your questions to guide particularly the second half of our conversation today. But if you'll use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to do that, that will help us. So use Q&A for your questions, use chat to speak to one another and speak to the larger community as we gather here today. Before I jump into this conversation, Robert, let me invite all of us to pause for a minute of silence and prayer. We believe that God is present to us in this virtual community, and we want to invite him into our conversations today as well. So let's bow for a moment of prayer. Eternal God, whom we know as Creator and Redeemer and ever-present Spirit, we ask for your blessing upon our lives, upon our callings, upon our vocation and service to you, that you would use this hour to bless us for the sake of your purposes in our world. And together we say, amen. Well, Robert, Randy and I spent a lot of time in congregations, and you do too. How would you describe what the mood is as you talk to pastors, ministers, church leaders? What are you seeing out there?
Well, last 2 years for sure, but even extended beyond that, a couple of years. I'm seeing congregations that have been experiencing their own degree of division and polarization around issues in our culture, and a lot of anxiety over COVID and politics and racial division. All of that's going on in the world around us, and it's certainly uh, been brought to church with us. And so I've seen a lot of anxious congregations and pastors dealing with them, and often not knowing what to expect and what to do. And reports are, at least anecdotally, I think there are some studies that there have been a lot of men and women leaving ministry during these years, either retiring early or just finding something else to do, sort of feeling like this wasn't what I signed up for. But congregations have been incredibly anxious over the last few years.
Yeah, exactly. That's the way I would describe what I'm seeing as well. And that there's a whole array of, as you're noting, there's a whole array of things that are going on, and they often just sort of stack up in congregational leadership and create a great deal of anxiety. And in some ways, and not that we're going to go do therapy here, but that anxiety then gives rise to yet other things. What happens when church leaders get anxious?
I use the word anxiety. I'm going to use it the way that I understand it to be used in Bowen family systems theory, which is it's not a disease, it's not a diagnosis. It is just a human reality that when we feel threats around us, we have automatic responses that are Bowen called reactivity or anxiety. And it's normal. It's one of the ways we've survived as human beings, as a species. So it's not the villain here, but it's a reality. And our anxiety goes up when we feel threatened, and we felt threatened from a lot of ways. And the symptoms of that rising anxiety are generally just four things. We have a small repertoire when it comes to how do we automatically respond to threat. And some people might know that in terms of fight, flight, and freeze. But Bowen talks about four things. He talks about conflict, that when anxiety rises, we become a little more edgy, a little more prone to disagreement and conflict, and my way's the right way. And so people get a little more conflictual when anxiety rises. We're prone to distance. That's like fleeing. Some of us, instead of engaging relationships conflictually, we withdraw and get quiet and irresponsible in some of our relationships. A third symptom he called over and under functioning, which is some people, and it's reciprocal in a congregation, for example, some people underfunction and they cease to take responsibilities that are theirs, and others move in and take them up for them. And the underfunctioner is the problem, but the overfunctioner's got a part to play. And so some people take over and some people give up. That's an anxious response during time of, it's sort of the freeze response in part. And then the other thing that happens is Bowen called projection or emotional triangles. We start looking for someone to blame or point the finger at or worry over or gossip about. Somebody all that anxiety gets projected on some part of the congregation or some person. The pastor may be very much the person that this is projected on. And Carson, I think about those, and we can talk about this later if you want to, but it's sort of four gauges on the dashboard that pastors and leaders can pay attention to and notice the symptoms changing, and then know that as symptoms increase, it shouldn't surprise us that anxiety has been increasing. And when we've got options, once we know, that stuff's going on.
Are those my only choices? If anxiety is a reality, none of those sound really great. Do I have any other options?
Those are the automatic responses. When we're running on automatic, we don't have any other choices. We're going to do one or more of those things. But what we do have a choice about is that God has graciously given us another part of our brain. Those all come from a part of the brain that happens without thinking. We don't, when you're in a crisis, if an 18-wheeler is moving over into your lane on I-35, this isn't a time to pull out a yellow pad and make 2 columns of pros and cons about what you should rationally do in this moment. You just need an automatic response. And That's what anxiety is. It's this automatic response to threat, and it saves our lives at the time. But when we live with it all the time, those same chemicals that were meant to just be in our body for a few minutes at most while we manage ourselves in anxious times, we live in that stew, and it's not a very healthy thing. But what we have in addition to that part of the brain that automatically responds is this prefrontal cortex God gave us to think. And we can, with effort, learn to be a rational, thoughtful person in the midst of threat and decide what action to take and not be limited to those four other things. But running automatic, that's pretty much, those are our options. If anybody knows another one, I'm open to learning, but those are the ones Bowen identified as automatic response.
Well, and in some ways that's tempting me to say, well, if these are the automatic moves that we make, what's a more proactive sort of move? And I want us to get to that. We need to get to that today, and I'm sure we will. But let's talk a little more about this business about conflict. I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only one who sees this, but churches are just full of conflict right now. Talk to us a little more about these four ways and how they can debilitate liveliness and healthfulness in congregations.
Conflict is the one that gets most of our attention because it's like a fire. I mean, it gets our attention. Some of us are afraid of it, and it all occurs on a scale. There's always some conflict going on in relationships, from mild disagreement up to the extreme. But some of us are sort of conflict averse, and as soon as there's any sign of that, we want to back off. Other people, it's their normal automatic response to engage it. But so we tend to treat conflict as the problem, and really it's a symptom of the problem. It's like I said, if you have on your dashboard these four gauges, and one of them is conflict, and one is a distance, and one is over under functioning, and one is projection, and you notice the needle starting to move on one or more of those, you know that anxiety's risen in that emotional system, whether that's your family or your congregation. And it doesn't do any good to grab the needle. If my truck starts running hot according to the gauge, it doesn't help to break the glass, grab the needle, and try to pull it back into the cold area. That doesn't cool down the engine. The needle's just a symptom of what's going on somewhere else in the system. So when conflict happens, we tend to we call in, we try conflict management things, and maybe call in outside consultants to help us with that. But if we don't deal with the underlying anxiety that's producing it, well, it's like playing whack-a-mole. I mean, you may get the conflict reduced, but that anxiety is going to show itself somewhere else in the system. So, and to add to that, when a symptom appears, no matter what it is, conflict, distance, other things, the symptom itself generates anxiety in us. It feels like a threat. The conflict feels like a threat. So we get more anxious and then more prone to symptoms, and it becomes really a downward spiral of regression in the system where we get less and less functional, I guess. And it takes somebody making other choices to bring a halt to that. I'll slow it down.
I'm looking through our list. We have people from all over America, including Alaska here, and someone from Ghana. And we probably have kind of varying understandings of systems. Bowen is a name for those who don't know it, that is kind of a groundbreaker in systems. But I've kind of joked sometimes that you can get four perfectly sane elders in churches of Christ and put them in the same room, and they'll lobotomize each other. That it's not just our individual pathologies. There's also a system that develops in the room that's not reducible to the individual parts. Can you say a little something about system that'll help?
Sure, Randy. That's at the heart of systems thinking, which is a hard thing to do. I mean, I don't claim to be able to do that more than a few minutes a day, I think, because our tendency is to see things as cause and effect, and we do that with human relationships. If there's a problem among the elders or a problem in the congregation, we ask, what's the cause? Why is it happening? And we point our fingers at one thing or another without seeing the part we play in that we are all in relationship with each other. We're constantly reacting, monitoring each other. Who's paying attention to me? Who needs me? Who's putting demands on me? Am I living up to their expectation? We got a ton of programs running in our heads all the time, governing the relationships that are important to us, whether that's family or congregational relationships. And, one of the kind of principles or of systems theory is that if there's a chronic problem going on in a system that I'm part of, then I'm part of the keeping it in place. So my job is to figure out what's my part and how do I change my part, because I'm not a victim. It's not somebody else's fault. We are all reacting to one another. And often, like you mentioned, you could probably pull one of those four elders out of there and replace them with another, and the same thing would go on, because that's the way the system is learned to operate. Until somebody in the system says, I've had enough of this and I'm going to behave differently, then the system has a chance to shift.
Well, that's pressing us to maybe some proactive kind of conversation here. If anxiety is present in the system and it's bigger than any one person, is there anything one person could do?
Yeah,
right?
It's sort of a good news, bad news thing, Carson. Is the good news, the bad news is that if a system has a chronic problem and I'm part of the system, I'm part of the problem. That's bad news. I can't point the blame to someone else. In fact, sort of the more influence I have in the system, if I'm a leader, for example, the greater my contribution to that probably. The good news is I'm not a victim. I don't have to just live with that. I can decide to make changes in my behavior. And if I can hold on to those changes while the system's pushing me to behave the way I used to, eventually the system has to shift. And if you think about a mobile hanging, with all the little pieces there, and it's reached a state of homeostasis. I mean, it's all balanced just as it is. I happen to know outside of Abilene, there's a little town, the name of it escaped by Albany, I think. Mm-hmm. And they have a wonderful art museum there. And they have in the art museum a Calder mobile, he's a famous mobile artist at any rate, a Calder mobile. Well, if you grab one piece of that mobile and you pull it to a new position and hold it there, the rest of the system, everything connected to it, one directly or indirectly, has to shift its position slightly. Now, the weight of the system is such that if I let go, it's going to go right back to where it was. But if systems are like that, if one person can make a change and hold it, the system's going to put its weight against that person to go back to where it was. But if it can be held, then the whole system shifts to some degree. And that's one of the things Bowen has a wonderful quotation about that just outlines that, but it sounds so easy and it's so difficult to pull off. But we're not victims. Whether it's in our family or in our congregation, we can decide what are our principles and how will I behave in this. And if I can calm myself down, that is, cease to respond to the anxiety as much as I have been, and offer a calmer presence among those in the system's going to eventually change after resisting my efforts and trying to pull me back into it. But if I can hold on to them.
I mean, there's something risky about perturbing a system, right? Everything can get so bad that you can think, okay, I've got to do something. But it's amazing how people will tolerate dysfunctional systems because it's what they know.
I mean, that's how you explain systems where family systems have an addiction present. The system gets organized usually around the least mature person in the system, and we all have a part to play in it, but we keep it in place, and we complain about it the whole time, but nevertheless. And you can see congregations that have long histories of doing just that thing, and they've learned it. I mean, it's been the way they've learned to dance. And I don't know if Church of Christ are allowed to dance or not, but we
tasteful choreography. That's what we do.
Okay, well, it's sort of, a dance is a good metaphor for that, because it's like we've learned, we've got a 3/4 beat plan. We're all going to dance a waltz. And we keep doing that until if somebody comes in and changes the tune and says, now we've got, 4/4 playing and we can't waltz anymore. And I'm going to hold on to that tune. Suddenly everybody else has to adjust to it. And they're not happy about doing that necessarily. There's seldom standing ovations and applause when a leader does that, but it is important to know that that is the possibility before us.
That's good. So part of that is about how the leader is managing their own anxiety, right? This is,
Exactly.
and so there's a big $64 word for that, of differentiation, right? You want to unpack more of that for us, Robert?
Sure. Bowen's term, he used two terms for this primarily. He used differentiation of self as his main phrase for what we're about to talk about. He had based his theory in biology. And you know that as a cell is developing, it begins as an undifferentiated cell when a new being is conceived. But growing inside the womb, those cells begin to differentiate. That is, they stay together as part of the forming human, but they take on differentiated cell or a brain cell or a skin cell. And in the same sort of way, Bowen thought that human families produce children who are at first kind of undifferentiated from their parents. They barely differentiated. They've been born into the world. They're no longer inside the mother's womb, but they're still very emotionally fused with the family. And as the child grows, the child becomes more or less differentiated emotionally, able to function on their own, think on their own, and yet stay connected to their family. And that's what the path of differentiation is. It's differentiation of a self, a person, from the family of origin. The other term Bowen used for that concept is, he called it emotional maturity. And that's a little easier to handle for most of us than differentiation of self. But the more emotionally mature one is, Bowen said, the better we're able to think for ourselves when anxiety is high in relationships and yet stay connected to those important people in our life. It's easy to be a calmer absence, to calm ourselves by getting out of that emotional system, either physically or somehow just kind of become emotionally shut down to that. And we can calm ourselves that way, or we can calm ourselves, or we can give in to the system and become an anxious presence where we just bear all the anxiety that's going on in the family or the congregation. But the better differentiated one is, the more emotionally mature, the more we can remain a less anxious presence, where we are connected to the important people, but we're responding less frequently or less intensely to all the anxiety going on. Does that make sense? Ed Friedman, who was one of Bowen's disciples, used the term non-anxious presence.
Right.
But and I'm not sure he meant that as radically as it sounds. There's no such thing as a non-anxious presence, except maybe in cemeteries. But the rest of us are responding all the time to anxiety. But to be a less anxious presence is a possibility. And one of the goals, I heard Dan Papirow of the Bowen Center, he's on the faculty there, use the term or the concept of just trying to be the least anxious person in the room. And if I can do that, I can be helpful to people because I can think a little better. Mm-hmm. So nobody has to be non-anxious. That's not a worthy goal.
That's just not realistic. Yeah.
And least anxious in the room. Generally, that bar's pretty low, so I might be able to get.
And that's a good point, though, Randy. It is a low bar often, but to the degree that we, have to just gather up ourself and be there and find a way to be present to these people and not buying into all their anxiety. That's a hard thing sometimes, especially say if that other person in the room is our spouse or our child. That's the hottest place, or even more so if it's our parents. that's probably the hottest space. So that's where we go to work on differentiation. We learn to be a self with these people, with our parents and with our nuclear family, our spouse and our children. And then, you know, an elders meeting is a piece of cake after that. But we work on it. Some, you know, the way I think of it is like, it's like the ring, you know, Frodo has. It's got to go back to Mount Doom where it was forged. And that was with our family of origin. So work on differentiation has to do with learning to be a self with these important people that brought us into the world.
That's good. That's good. So part of this business about managing anxiety has to do about really managing ourselves. I mean, that's the place we start. Is that fair to say, Robert?
And anything else is a kind of manipulation. I kind of hear sometimes pastors get interested in family systems theory thinking, okay, I'm going to understand this and then I'm going to be able to get my church working right or my family working right. And that's a totally backwards focus. The question is always, how can I be present and accounted for in these systems that I'm part of? How can I be the best version of a father that I want to be? What kind of husband do I want to be? What kind of son or daughter do I want to be? And what kind of pastor do I believe I ought to? What are my principles? That's what work on self is about. It's not being selfish. It's about growing. It's about changing so that I've got contributions to make to these systems that I'm part of. You don't. I think sometimes people misunderstand this and think that, well, I'm just going to go have my way in the system, and that's differentiation, and that's a long way from what Bowen had in mind. It's about being part of it and a responsible part of it. And being responsible means I'm not going to give in to everybody's anxiety. I'm going to find a way to stay connected to them, but to think at the same time and to express what I think and believe.
If it's that connected to, and we have a question that kind of goes in this direction to family of origin and what I've kind of learned to do, I'm going to bring that over into other systems. Do all our leaders need to go into therapy? Is there a way to get to emotional maturity and differentiation without years of?
Well, I think it's a lifetime project, Randy. I really do. I don't like discipleship is. I mean, we don't pop into Christ-likeness in a matter of weeks or by reading a book or going to a course. We do that through a lot of things, including a lifetime of practicing spiritual disciplines or spiritual practices. We pray, we worship, we may have a mentor or a discipler in our life, somebody who's a little further down the road that we spiritual director, there's a lot of terms for this, but a spiritual companion, somebody who loves Christ and follows Christ, and we engage with them so that we can learn to do better what it is they're doing and what we want. And in the same way, and I do think of work on family as being a kind of spiritual practice for me. I mean, it is to have a coach, somebody is the term that is often used in the Bowen crowd. They don't speak of a therapist so much, but a coach, someone who's sort of on the sideline, who can think with you about your family, about what you're up against, and then send you back into the game to run a play and think about how did that turn out, how'd that work. But somebody who understands systems, who's not a part of your system, so they've got some distance and they can think with you about it. That's helpful. But there are a lot of things a person can do to work on differentiation itself. One is going back home whenever possible, being present for important family moments, weddings, anniversaries, funerals, family reunions, and going to those intentionally to be with family and to have a goal of getting to know family members in a one-to-one relationship, which is we tend to know our families, even our family of origin, in kind of a glob. You know, it's mom and dad, and a lot of us haven't ever known our mother and our father as individuals and sat and talked with them about what they've been up against in life and what their life has been like. And I came to this to this stuff not out of curiosity or encountering it, reading a book, and thinking it was a nifty idea. I came to it out of my own personal misery with some stuff going on in my own family, and it was life-saving to me and family-saving, and in some ways ministry-saving, to begin to encounter some of these ideas. But my parents had already been deceased when I started, and I just, I really ache over that. I've got 1,000 conversations I'd like to have with my parents over the last 20 years, and they're not available any longer. But that's part of the work, is having those one-to-one relationships. So there are things you can do. You get a coach, you can read theory, try to understand the concepts, which are not rocket science. This isn't hard to understand. It's just the way human beings behave. That's all. Bowen didn't claim to have invented anything. He was just observing stuff. And but then the hard work is the going to work on yourself in your family.
How does, Robert, how does, kind of going back to your metaphor earlier of the dashboard that's signaling, the engine's running hot on conflict and over under functioning, blame projection, distancing. Is there a way in which those become clues for us, then to kind of maybe some of the work we may need to do to attend to those things?
That's a great question, Carson. I think the more emotionally mature people are, the more they use all four of those things as a way of managing anxiety.
Yes.
And they're not, again, this isn't disease, okay? It just gets, sometimes it makes a mess and we have to clean it up. But sometimes people focus on one of those. And if the only way they know to deal with their anxiety is conflict, they're very conflictual. Or if the only way they know is distance, they really pull out. But when we have all four of those available to us as sort of automatic responses, they don't get as generally as intense as they might. But it does tell, I don't know how to think about that, is there something, if my family, I'll think about my family, if I find myself distancing, that's an indicator that there is something for me to work on. There's some anxiety with my wife or my kids that I'm not paying attention to, and I need to pull back in. If I find myself on edge all the time, then where's that anxiety coming from? I've got maybe some reparations to make with family members, but I really need to figure out what's going on, what's changed. That's always a good question, is why now? Why is that needle moved today instead of yesterday? What changed? What's going on in my life that's making me more anxious I just haven't picked up on? And how do I really want to think about those things instead of this automatic way? So I don't know if that responded to your question or not, but
yeah. What do we do if we have a relatively healthy leader in a system that is just killing? Yeah. And that, trying to work out of a less anxious place, trying to perturb the system, it just doesn't seem like it's going to get perturbed. What do you do? And if you, I mean, most people are not going to be conversant with systems language, so even raising the awareness there may be a challenge.
Yeah, I think we're more or less, this is, okay, I'm using marriage as a model. When Bowen talks about how marriages work, he says that we come out of our family of origin with some level of differentiation. He had an arbitrary scale he just made up of 0 to 100. He didn't have an instrument you could take to measure where you were on there. He just observing that people vary in their emotional maturity. And he said, most people we've ever met are below 50 on that scale, which means that 50% of the time, if they were 50, they'd be pretty emotionally mature. It would mean half the time they're responding thoughtfully rather than reacting. He said most of us, are between 25 and 35. I mean, most of the time we're reacting rather than thinking. So we come out of our family of origin with some degree of differentiation. If our parents have not focused on us too much and worried over us too much in their anxiety, we might come out with a little more emotional maturity than they had. If we were the product of their focus, their anxious focus, we may come out with a little more impaired in our emotional maturity. But it's a given that when we leave home, we've got a given level of emotional maturity. Then we got to seek someone to marry. We will seek out someone who's very close to ours, our level. Because if we got married to somebody or we encountered somebody who was much more emotionally mature than we were, they wouldn't put up with us very long. We would seem too needy and clingy and unpredictable. And by the same token, if we met somebody who was significantly less emotionally mature, we would experience that. So we find somebody who's willing to invest about as much self into this relationship as we do. And we get fused together in this new emotional system. Okay, that makes sense to me as well. But I've wondered about congregations and their leaders, whether congregations also seek out someone of about the same level of emotional maturity as that group. I mean, any given congregation's got a range of people in it. But I think we sort of, if we go visit, say we're looking for a church to join, and we go to a church and it's emotionally immature or led by emotionally immature people and more than we are, we might sort of sniff that out and go, I'm not sure I want to be a part of this. By the same token, I think that leaders that are called to serve congregations are going to find a real mismatch if their level of maturity is significantly more than that of the primary leaders in the congregation. I would hope that you discern that in the call process and say, I'm not sure this is where I belong. But if you find yourself in the middle of that, you can deal with it for so long, but no, I don't know any really emotionally mature people that could stick it out for long before they get done in by that system. And I think if you've got a system that is, even if you're more emotionally mature than they are, than most of the leaders there, if they just persist in that, I don't know any other way but out, to find another place to serve. And there are some congregations that have years and years of systemic immaturity, and they run off one pastor after another, or killed off one pastor after another, and they just keep going. And
yeah, sadly, that's
the thing to weigh is if I can't. Long before I ever heard of systems or anything, I heard someone tell if it's like sitting on a block of ice as a leader in a system like that. If the ice doesn't melt, you're going to freeze. So you've got to decide whether is the ice melting at a sufficient rate, or do I take my frostbite and go somewhere else?
wow. Great image. Thanks, Robert. To all of our viewers, look, please send in your questions. I'm going to start turning. We've got a couple, 3 here that are coming in that I think are wonderfully placed for us to continue a conversation, but welcome more questions from our viewers. Got a question here, Robert, that's come in that kind of extends some of this conversation. If you have some awareness about systems theory, how do you, is there a way of teaching a congregation to be more aware of systems theory, or about their own, maybe we could just say their own emotional or spiritual maturity? How do you bring a congregation along in this?
I hear that question often. I think one of the first tendencies that we have is when we encounter something new, an idea and a concept or a way of doing something, and it appeals to us, it makes sense to us. One of the first things we're going to do is go share the good news and go tell everybody else about it so that they can do it too. However, in this case, Bowen says one of there are two forces at work in emotional systems. One is the force he called togetherness force, and the other is the force of individualization. And there, it's this, we all live with that in the middle of emotions. The desire to be me, which is individualization, the desire to be we, which is the togetherness force. And when anxiety increases, the togetherness force goes way up. We have a herd instinct. We like, wildebeest and being threatened by a lion. It's we all pull together, we get in the same bunch, and we go the same direction. And that sort of togetherness force is often togetherness is an anxious response. And it can be an anxious response to say, if I just go teach everybody else about what I've just learned, then maybe they'll get it and things will get better. Or we could all have the same language to speak about what's going on. Bowen suggested that rather than do something like that in your own family, that is go make your wife and kids read a family systems book or something, you just go live it for a few years. And then maybe if you're finding out you're living it, then people have questions, or why did, that's one thing. Dallas Willard, I don't know if you all know that name. He is written in spiritual formation, and but he was lecturing one time on one of his books. I think it was The Divine Conspiracy, and same kind of question came up. Someone raised a question from the audience and said, should we go home and maybe buy copies of this book and have our staff and congregational leaders read it and everything? And Willard sort of leaned on the lectern and he said, I've determined that it's best not to announce the revolution. And I kind of like that. It's like, live it for a couple of years, work on yourself. You don't need to use these terms and concepts and throw those around, just work on it. And in time, it might be time to teach. I wouldn't start there though. I just really wouldn't.
The importance of embodying it yourself in the community. Yeah, matters. Yeah, that's good. That's good. Let's see, what else we got? Fear and anxiety. You've defined anxiety, Robert, a bit, but is fear and anxiety the same thing? The question comes when we talk about congregational context: is fear and anxiety the same thing or not?
I'm not sure how all those terms overlap. Probably fear is, in Bowen's term, a form of distancing. It is our desire to flee when something threatens us rather than lean into it. And so, yeah, it probably fits in that category. It's an anxious response.
Mm-hmm.
There are things to be afraid of. I mean, fear is not, God gave us that. Now, he doesn't want us to live in fear, and he certainly doesn't want us to be afraid of things that are, that are not to be feared, but to live in the fear of God, to be able to trust God. But fears, saved my life on more than one occasion, and it probably has yours. But it's also caused me a lot of problems when I was afraid of things or acting out of fear that I shouldn't have been afraid of. I can think of 1,000 examples. I think we live in one of the most fearful cultures I can imagine. I mean, we're afraid of each other. Democrats are afraid of Republicans, and people of different races are afraid of each other. We're afraid. We're carrying weapons with us, even to church, because we're afraid. And it just, fear permeates the way we think. And I think if any body of people could do better, it's the church. We need to hear Jesus had frequent admonitions not to be afraid, to manage our fear. This is the thing about what we talked about being a calmer presence is the fear, the anxiety is an automatic response. It's not going to go away, right? But we have the capacity, if we can, to push the pause button and to process the threat and to say, is this really life-threatening? Is this person sitting across from me who voted differently than me or who has a different opinion than I do? Are they really a threat to my life? And is it possible I could calm down just enough to listen to them or not to engage in conflict with them, but to find that's the management of that fear or that automatic response. And that's hard as everything. I mean, in our world, especially, if I add this, there is an intellectual process that God has given us. It's called curiosity. And the more we can be curious about things, maybe the little bit less we're afraid of things. Mm-hmm. And curiosity leads us to investigate, to think, to ask questions, to listen. One of my friends she's been my coach in Bowen Family Systems Theory, Victoria Harrison, she formulated a question to use in those awkward moments when we're encountering someone whose belief system these days is radically different than our own. And rather than engaging in a big conflict and trying to prove them wrong, she just has learned to say, I'm very interested in how it is that you and I see the world so different. And just being interested, being curious about our family, being curious about our spouse, our congregation, or that troublesome person in the congregation is a move. It's a shift in our head that allows us to calm down for a little bit and to be maybe a calmer person in the room. So fear is a real thing, but not everything we're afraid of, we need to be afraid of. Not everything is life-threatening. And when it is life-threatening, we need to get out of Dodge, or freeze or flee or fight or something. But it's not life-threatening. It might be a good time to try to figure out another way to think in that moment. As long as
it seems to me one of the challenges of that is that fear sells. And but both political parties primarily traffic in fear. You should be very afraid, and we're the only ones who can save you. And that fear has permeated sort of everything. And that it seems to me that is a calling of the church that we're going to take a different approach. We're not going to be, if we believe our own eschatology, then we need to get some control on our fear response, and that might be one of the marks of the church. But there are nobody more fearful and anxious than church people. And that's curious to me that we're not. Doesn't sound like we're quite buying our own gospel, but the culture pressure towards fear is so strong that it kind of feels like you're tilting at a windmill.
Mm-hmm. I think that is one of the biggest challenges pastors and churches face these days, and you certainly don't want to come to worship and go home more fearful than when you came. I mean, often pastors can be involved in stirring up the anxiety that is the culture's already doing with, multiple news networks, 24-hour news, and politicians. And to find a third way that says we're present in the middle of this worldwide epidemic that is real and is life-threatening, but we can live wisely and thoughtfully, but not fearfully. How do we do that? Mm-hmm. It's a challenge for us. Let me tell you a story. It's in the book, but I have diminished hearing. I've had diminished hearing for a long time in my life. Right now, I have none in my right ear and diminished in the left. But when I was pastor at University Baptist in Houston, one of the things I couldn't hear are high-pitched noises like the fire alarm. So one Sunday, I was preaching to the 11 o'clock congregation, and I was preaching from Mark chapter 4 about the crossing of the sea and the storm. And Jesus questioned, "Why were you so afraid? Where's your faith?" And fire alarm went off while I was preaching, and I couldn't hear it. And I just started noticing, literally, visibly, the anxiety in the congregation. I see people shifting and looking at each other and looking around, and I just kept preaching. And Jesus said, "Fear not," and all that. And after a while, they kind of thought, "Well, he's just messing with us," because I would never set off a fire alarm, but I would sometimes do things in preaching that tried to get their attention or make a point. But they kind of figured, I guess, that I was messing with them. And the congregation calmed down. The fire alarm was going off, but because I wasn't nervous about it, they calmed down. then someone came in from the side and said, Pastor, the fire alarm's going off. We need to evacuate. Okay, we could do that too. But it was a lesson to me about how powerful a calmer presence in the room can be to people, that especially if they're looking to their leader. Now, my calm presence, could have gotten us all burned to a crisp, but it at least illustrated the way that systems work sometimes around. Now, if I've been fearful, I mean, who wants to be on an airplane where the pilot comes on and goes, "Oh my gosh, we've got an instrument not working." I mean, it's not what we need, is it?
Right. That's good. I got a question coming in here from someone who works in a institution of higher learning, which will remain nameless, but it might be Baylor, it might be ECU. So
we'll remain nameless,
but we're going to leave it nameless. But talking about what does it mean to lead in the middle? You've got you're attending to a community that you're trying to influence, while at the same time you've got persons above you who you're trying to manage or live in relationship with. This is not altogether dissimilar to a lot of congregational leadership as well, where you're trying to manage from a place in the middle. But talk a little bit about managing and engaging anxiety in a system where you live in the middle. You're always in the middle.
Yeah.
I'll take a shot at that.
I think that'd be similar to being in a family where you're one of the children rather than the parents. Your influence is somewhat diminished from what it would be if you were at the top of the system.
Mm-hmm.
But your influence doesn't go away no matter where you're located in a system. I think that's a principle. Go back to the mobile. There are pieces of the mobile that are less directly connected to others, and so a move of one barely moves the other. Adjust it to some degree. So I think it just, no matter where we are, the work is, how do I work on myself? How do I be present and accounted for? How do I be the calmest person in the room and let my influence spread where it will? I may not be able to change the direction of the whole organization, but the people that work with me hopefully are going to work with a person who's thinking more than they're reacting, or at least reacting a little less often. I use a metaphor that stuck with me of batting averages. If a baseball player bats .250 lifetime, they're a mediocre player. They're not going to be Hall of Fame. They may stay in the major leagues for a long time, but .250 is not going to get too excited about it. Somebody that bats .350 lifetime, however, is going to name their own salary, play for whomever they want to. They're going to be a Hall of Fame. But the difference in the behavior or their life is that the .350 hitter gets one more hit in every 10 times at bat than the .250 hitter, or every 2.5 games he gets one more hit, but he bats .350. And that sort of helps me to think that a little is a big improvement over nothing. That if I could be a little less anxious, a little more thoughtful with my family or where I work, one day out of 10 or one event out of 10, I've moved way up the ranking in terms of influence. But I don't have to bat 1,000. Nobody bats 1,000.
Right.
And I think that's a worthy goal, no matter where you are in the system, is be the best version of yourself, the most connected you can be to Christ and His Spirit, the most thoughtful and the calmest and the least fearful and least reactive as you can be in that place. And it'll be a benefit to you and those around you.
Yeah. Thank you. Hey, we're coming up near the end of the hour. I do want to ask Randy and Robert both to here in just a moment, and I'll start with Randy with this. What's the one thing that you would say as we wrap up? What would be the one thing you'd want to leave everybody with as we've been having this conversation about dealing with being a good, capable pastoral leader in troubled times, as we've been reflecting a lot about family systems thinking here today. So, Randy, what would you leave us with? What strikes you?
Well, I think what struck me most is, okay, you're not just a victim. So let me pay attention and take responsibility for my part of the system, because that's something I could do to start doing today. And I think I think that's really hard. I think of myself as the right one, and the rest of the system is all messed up. And I think starting to become self-aware of the ways that I might be contributing to the dysfunction of the system is a great spiritual centered place to start, to ask God to kind of start to graciously work on you in that. And we've got some people who are in systems so sick that for their own sake they need to get out. But to me, that's not the primary word for today. The primary word is, okay, let me become attentive to how I'm functioning in this system.
That's good. Thanks, Randy. Robert, what would you offer to us as you reflect about our conversation this hour?
The subtitle of that book is A Map for Ministry. And that's how I have come to think about Bowen systems, Bowen family systems theory, is the territory or human relationships. And we need a map to negotiate the territory, well, a way of thinking about the territory. Right. And what Bowen is trying to do is just describe human behavior. He says this is the way humans behave, not Americans, not 20th century or 21st century Americans, not white Americans or Black Americans. This is human behavior that has been built into our DNA over thousands of years. This is the way we respond. And so having a way of thinking about human behavior, just watching what's going on, helps me have options about what I do next, just like having a map of the territory instead of just being lost. I can say, well, I've got this route I could try, or this route I could try, or that mountain's too high to go over. I'm going to have to go around that. It gives me a way to think about it. And I don't have to live with a bunch of memorized, leadership principles to apply. I have a way of thinking about what's going on in my family or in my congregation. And then I can maybe generate some ideas about, and I run a lot of experiments is what I would call them, is like, this is what seems to be happening. Let me run an experiment. I'll try this and see how the system responds. And that'll give me some, if the system does absolutely nothing, then I made no changes. It didn't bother them at all. But I think that's it, is systems theory is a way of thinking about relationships. And that's what pastoral ministry is. It's just a huge set of relationships. And so it gives me a way to think about what I'm doing. And,
right. Yeah, that's wise and sane. Thank you so much, Robert. Thank you, Randy, for being here today. And thank you to all of our viewers for being a part of this great conversation today. I want to say thank you to Renee and to her team and all the logistics that go behind making the webinar run smoothly and well. And viewers, we've got in March, what we're doing instead of a regular intersection is we're partnering with the Graduate School of Theology here at ACU. As the Baptist Center is hosting or co-hosting an event with them on migration. I think the title is Migration and Ministry. On March the 22nd, you'll find information about it on our website. And I think we probably will get something. It's coming on your chat there, as well as ways of connecting for our next event from Siburt Institute through the webinar frame. So thank you all for being here today. Again, Robert, thank you. And I'll just make another shameless plug for your books, Robert. As a person who's using Dr. Creech's material in seminary work, I want to commend his work to you. You'll find it sane, well-grounded in theology and scholarship, and deeply pastoral. He understands and knows what congregational ministry is about, and you'll see the wisdom of it on every page. So, Robert, thank you for your time again today.
And thank you and Randy for conversation, for having me, and I really appreciate it. It's been a delight. Randy, I'm going to invite you to offer a benediction as we let that be our last word together as a community today.
The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and give you peace. To him who's able to keep you from falling and to present you before his glorious presence without fault and with great joy. To the only God, our Savior, be glory and majesty, dominion and power through Jesus Christ our Lord, before all ages, now and forevermore, world without end. Amen.